Ryan's office revenge. The bolt snapped clean off like it knew something I didn't. I was just trying to get the alternator loose on my '87 Mustang when my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp in my back pocket. Wiped my greasy hands on my old Carhartt jacket and checked the screen. Come to HQ now. No greeting, no signature, just those 4 words from someone working on a Sunday. Now you have to understand, after 22 years at that place, Sundays were my sanctuary. That quiet hum of the air compressor in my garage, the radio playing classic rock, the peace of not being needed by anyone. I'm Jason Mitchell, 47 years old, and I hadn't taken a real day off in 3 years. But they all knew Jason never really unplugged. Still, even for me, this was weird. I stared at that message like it was written in blood. HQ was 45 minutes away. The CEO was in Singapore wrapping up the most expensive acquisition in our company's history, a $320 million deal that had everyone walking on eggshells for months. Nobody, and I mean nobody, should be working on a Sunday unless the building was literally on fire. I stood there another second, looking at my torn-apart engine bay. The fuel pump I'd been nursing along all spring sat there mocking me. Classic car restoration was my therapy, the one thing that made sense when corporate politics didn't. But that phone wasn't going to stop buzzing. I sighed, tossed my wrench into the toolbox, and muttered, "Guess peace was optional today." Here's the thing about emergencies in corporate America. They're usually manufactured by people who confuse urgency with importance. But something in my gut said this one was different. Maybe it was the fact that whoever sent that text didn't even bother with pleasantries. In my 22 years climbing from junior analyst to senior risk assessment director, I'd learned to read the temperature of panic. This felt ice cold. I didn't change out of the work clothes, didn't even wash the grease off my hands completely. Let them see me as I was, a guy who actually worked with his hands, not some VP with an MBA, and a motivational quote for every crisis. My ex-military background had taught me that authenticity beats performance every single time. Got in my pickup, still reeking of motor oil and that pine tree air freshener that died 6 months ago, and drove through the empty Sunday streets. The parking lot was half empty when I arrived, which made my stomach drop. You know that feeling when you pull up to work on a weekend and see just a handful of cars scattered like survivors? That's not overtime. That's a tribunal. The building felt different on weekends. Hollow, like all the corporate energy had been sucked out through the ventilation system. Even the security guard didn't look up from his crossword puzzle as I badged in. "Working hard or hardly working, Jerry?" I called out. But he just grunted. Not even Jerry was in a mood for small talk. That should have been my second warning sign. Elevator dinged like a death knell as I hit the button for the 12th floor. Executive level. Through the glass walls, I could see lights blazing in the main conference room. That cold blue glow they think makes deals look more important. As the elevator climbed, I found myself thinking about Stephen Parker, our old general counsel who'd retired 8 months ago. Smart guy, quiet like me, always said the most dangerous people in corporate America were the ones who smiled too much and talked too fast. The moment I walked into that boardroom, I knew I wasn't there for consultation. Every chair was filled like they were conducting a funeral service. Legal team looking grim, finance people shuffling papers like dealers at a poker table, communications department already crafting damage control in their heads. One of the junior HR people looked like she was about to lose her breakfast all over her iPad. My old cubicle buddy Justin was there too, sipping water from a plastic bottle like it was whiskey. We'd started the same week 22 years ago, back when the company still had a pension plan, and people actually retired instead of just burning out. He didn't wave when he saw me, just gave me that look that said, "Sorry in advance, brother." That's when I saw it on the big screen. Front and center was a scanned document that made my blood pressure spike. One clause highlighted in red, like blood on fresh snow. Times New Roman, 12-point font, 115-line spacing, the exact formatting I used for every compliance policy I'd ever written. But here's the thing that made my hands start shaking. I hadn't written this document. My full name was right there in the header, bold as day. Emergency Pus, Executive Oversight Clause. The date stamp said 8 months ago, but I was looking at legal language I'd never seen before in my life. It was written in that special kind of corporate speak that sounds like English but cuts like a scalpel. The kind of precision that said if any executive action posed material risk to fiduciary integrity. During an open contractual transaction, Jason Mitchell had veto authority. Full stop. No appeals, no override, no exceptions. I blinked hard, swallowed, took a step closer to the screen. The silence in that room was so thick you could have carved it with a butter knife. 20-something years in this business, and I'd never seen a room full of executives look so much like deer in headlights. "This isn't mine," I said slowly, making direct eye contact with Michelle Rodriguez from our legal team. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Where exactly did this come from?" Dead silence. One guy from finance actually scooted his chair back from the table like the document might explode and take out half the conference room. Another cleared his throat like he was trying to dislodge a golf ball, but no words came out. I looked at the bottom of the clause, and that's when my stomach dropped through the floor and kept falling. There was a signature there, all right, but it wasn't mine. It was someone I hadn't seen in 8 months. Stephen Parker, our old general counsel who'd supposedly retired to play golf in Arizona and drink bourbon on his back porch. But that lazy signature with the distinctive looped S and the way he always crossed his P's, it was real. He'd written this thing. He'd signed it. And somehow, this nuclear weapon had been buried so deep in our contract archives that nobody bothered to read it until today, when it apparently decided to detonate in all our faces. Michelle Rodriguez from legal finally cleared her throat like a guilty priest confessing to embezzlement. "There are discrepancies in the acquisition disclosures," she said, shuffling through papers like they might spontaneously combust. "Singapore flagged them this morning. The clause triggered automatic escalation." "To me," I said, feeling like the slowest guy in a room full of rocket scientists. "To you," she echoed, and the way she said it made me realize I wasn't the only one who'd been blindsided by this corporate landmine. I stared back at that screen, at my name glowing like a neon sign in a storm. This clause I'd never touched was now acting like a spotlight over a pit trap that somebody had been digging for months. And for the first time in 22 years, I realized I wasn't just background noise anymore. I was holding the detonator. Here's what really bothered me. I didn't sit down. Couldn't. Instead, I stood at the end of that polished conference table like I was about to deliver a eulogy at a funeral nobody had invited me to. From the looks on their faces, maybe that's exactly what this was. The screen still glowed with that single paragraph highlighted in blood red. Emergency Oversight Clause. Authority Transfer Contingency. Subject, Jason Mitchell. Date, filed March 15th, 8 months ago to the day, right around the time Stephen Parker cleaned out his office and disappeared into retirement with nothing but a bottle of bourbon and that quiet smile of his. My breath caught as I studied the formatting more carefully. I hadn't written this clause, but somebody who knew exactly how I worked had crafted it. Indented 1.1 theme lines, legal citations with hanging indents, Oxford commas standing proud, like middle fingers to corporate streamlining. In 22 years, only 2 people in this company ever formatted documents that precisely. Me and Stephen Parker. Stephen, The ex-general counsel who always told me, "Someday they're going to try to use your silence as a weapon, Mitchell. When that day comes, make sure you've got something sharp to cut them with." The man had retired 8 months ago, just vanished into the Arizona desert with his golf clubs and his secrets. But this document, this was his signature move, his parting gift. A clause buried so deep in the contract archives that nobody would notice it until the exact moment it was designed to detonate. The old devil had written me an insurance policy and disguised it as corporate protocol. "Why is this clause active?" I asked. And my voice carried that edge I'd learned in the service, the tone that said I expected straight answers, not corporate tap dancing. "The acquisition contract includes a fail-safe provision," Michelle said, and I could tell she was reading from notes like she was afraid of missing something important. "Any material misrepresentation in fiduciary disclosures automatically triggers emergency compliance oversight. And that oversight," I said flatly, "is me." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the HVAC system cycling in the walls. Then I started scanning faces around that table, really looking at each person. And that's when I spotted him. Dead center, spine straight, and wearing a smirk like he'd just solved the Sunday crossword in record time. Kevin Walsh, Interim Chief Operating Officer, the CEO's nephew, fresh off a podcast circuit tour and a couple of meaningless stints at VC-backed startups with logos shinier than their balance sheets. 30 years old and calling himself a transformation catalyst. The kind of guy who thought due diligence was optional if you had enough buzzwords and perfectly rolled shirt sleeves. He looked the least surprised to see me standing there in my work clothes. And that told me everything I needed to know about who'd triggered this mess. "Why am I here, Kevin?" I asked, cutting through the corporate fog like a blade through butter. He leaned back in his chair, trying for casual but missing by about a country mile. "We figured you'd want to help navigate this little hiccup," he said with that $1,000,000 smile they probably taught him at business school. "Legal says the clause names you as designated authority. Obviously it's outdated language, but..." "Outdated but activated," I interrupted. "It was signed, filed, and according to what I'm hearing, you're the one who triggered it." His smile flickered like a candle in the wind, but he tried to recover. "Look, Jason, nobody's accusing you of anything here. This is just cleanup work, you understand? We need someone to validate a few numbers before Singapore opens for business tomorrow morning. Cleanup work." Those 2 words hit me like a slap across the face. My spine went rigid as I realized what this really was. A setup designed to make me the fall guy. They wanted me to walk into a corner where I'd be holding the broom when Singapore's legal team found whatever rot Kevin had tried to hide. I stepped forward, and 22 years of dealing with corporate nonsense crystallized into perfect clarity. "Show me the full clause," I said. Michelle fumbled with her laptop like her fingers had suddenly forgotten how keyboards worked. Too slow for my patience, so I walked around the table and took control of the screen myself. The wording was airtight, legal language so precise it could perform surgery. Any financial misrepresentation under executive purview automatically seated compliance veto authority with the named individual, me, until the CEO returned or the discrepancies were completely cleared. It was elegant, ruthless, and legally bulletproof. Stephen Parker had written this thing for war, and somehow I'd just inherited command of the battlefield. "Where are the flagged discrepancies?" I asked, and my voice carried the kind of authority that made junior officers jump back in my military days. Nobody moved. 20 executives sitting around a table worth more than most people's houses, and not one of them wanted to be the first to open their mouth. "Someone better start talking," I continued, "because I'm not signing anything until I know exactly what kind of fire I'm supposed to be putting out." Michelle finally cleared her throat again, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. Singapore's legal counsel flagged 4 inconsistencies in the balance disclosures, she said, reading from her notes like they were radioactive. Offshore subsidiaries not listed in preliminary reports, and a significant liability discrepancy on the Hong Kong licensing deal. I turned slowly to look at Kevin, and I could see a bead of sweat forming at his hairline despite the conference room being cold enough to hang meat. "You signed those filings," I said. He shrugged like we were talking about lunch plans instead of a $320 million acquisition. "Look, I thought they were finalized when they went through. You were out of office when the final packet needed approval. We had a hard deadline to meet with Singapore." I laughed once, and it came out bitter as black coffee. "That was 2 days in July, a weekend. You rushed a $320 million transaction because I wasn't available for 48 hours? Things move fast in today's market," he said, like that explained away everything from global warming to the national debt. I stared at him long enough to see that nervous tick starting behind his confident mask. The kid wasn't as smooth as he thought he was. He was cornered, and I was the only person in that room with completely clean hands. No fingerprints on the deal, no approvals logged under my name, nothing to tie me to Kevin's mess, except this clause that Stephen Parker had gift-wrapped for exactly this moment. Thanks to 8 months of careful planning by a man I'd barely spoken to, I was now holding the kill switch on the biggest deal in company history. Scott Davis, the old-school board member who'd been quiet as a church mouse up until now, finally spoke up. The guy had been around long enough to remember when handshakes still meant something in business. "Can you verify the reports, Mitchell?" "I can," I said, meeting his eyes. "But I'll need the original documents, not whatever sanitized version Kevin submitted." That got a reaction. Kevin's face went through about 3 different shades of pale before settling on something that reminded me of spoiled milk. Scott nodded like a man who'd just made a decision that was going to cost someone their career. "Make it happen." I moved around to the far side of that conference table and grabbed a legal pad, started writing down exactly what I needed. Internal backup files, unredacted financial statements, complete audit trails, every single compliance document from the last 8 weeks. If they wanted this clause to stay active, they were going to see exactly what that meant. I wasn't signing off on anybody's creative accounting. Here's what really started clicking for me as I studied that glowing paragraph on the screen. Stephen Parker hadn't written this clause to protect the company. He'd written it to protect me. Because somewhere in his 30-year career, he'd figured out they were eventually going to try throwing someone under the bus when things went sideways. And he'd made damn sure that someone couldn't be me. The clock on the boardroom wall ticked away like it was counting down to something explosive. Nobody wanted to move much, and the only sounds were the HVAC system humming and my pen scratching across legal pad paper as I went through the documents. Michelle had reluctantly slid across the table. 43 pages of acquisition disclosures, supposedly reviewed, verified, and double-signed by our executive team. Kevin's signature was right there in blue ink, bold as you please, right next to what should have been our CEO's signature. Except it wasn't. It was a digital proxy signature. One of those automated approvals that gets triggered when someone's out of the country. Aaron Walsh had set up the system before flying to Singapore, and Kevin had timed everything perfectly so the CEO's electronic stamp would hit those documents before any final edits were made. The kid had played the system like a violin, and he'd thought nobody would ever notice. I checked my phone again. Still radio silence from Aaron, who was probably somewhere over the Pacific Ocean at 35,000 feet, completely unaware that his company was hanging by a compliance thread he'd never even read. I tried texting him again. "Urgent. Call immediately. Singapore deal. Compromised." Nothing came back but digital silence. Then Michelle spoke up, barely loud enough to hear. "He's mid-flight. No satellite Wi-Fi on that route. Perfect. The one person who could override this entire mess was trapped in a flying aluminum tube, sipping airline coffee and watching movies while his nephew drove the company toward an iceberg. Scott leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been in corporate warfare long enough to recognize a genuine crisis. Let's assume Aaron doesn't land for another 8 hours. The clause is active, Singapore's legal team is asking questions, and according to what we're seeing here, you're the only one authorized to answer them. All eyes turned back to me, and I could feel the gravity of the situation settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. 22 years of staying in the background, of being the guy who fixed problems quietly and never asked for credit. And suddenly I was center stage in the most expensive corporate drama in company history. Kevin tried one more time to sound reasonable, but I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. Look, Jason, we just need you to review the flagged sections and send Singapore a clarification memo. Carbon copy their legal team and we can clean this whole thing up before Asian markets open. Clarification memo. Right. 10 minutes ago, I was their forgotten compliance guy, and now they wanted me to perform emergency surgery on a $320 million deal with nothing but corporate band-aids and prayer. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 47 years, and looked Kevin directly in the eyes. Let me get something crystal clear, I said, and my voice carried that authority I'd learned commanding troops who were a lot tougher than corporate executives. I didn't authorize any of these figures. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't even informed. This clause doesn't make me your janitor, Kevin. It makes me your judge. The youngest guy in the room, some finance kid who looked like he hadn't slept since the quarterly reports came out, raised his hand like we were in high school. There's one more thing, he said nervously. The clause wasn't just triggered internally. It automatically notified Singapore's legal team. Their general counsel already knows about the oversight transfer. Michelle's face went white as copy paper. When? The kid checked his phone. About an hour ago. I think they're waiting for our official response. Perfect. So not only was I holding the detonator, but Singapore had already seen the explosion. They knew someone had pulled the emergency brake on their $320 million deal. If we didn't respond fast and smart, they'd assume the whole operation was compromised and walk away with their checkbook. That's when it really hit me. I wasn't the fix for this mess. I was the firewall. Stephen Parker's clause had done exactly what that clever old fox intended. It took the one person with clean hands and put him in a blast-proof room with complete authority. Not to rebuild what Kevin had broken, but to keep it from getting worse. I sat down for the first time since walking into that room and looked around the table. Here's how this works now. I'll review every document. I'll talk to Singapore's legal team directly, but I want complete authority to pause any and all executive decisions related to this acquisition until I say otherwise. Kevin's mouth opened like he was going to object, then snapped shut when he realized he didn't have a choice. You buried this clause 8 months ago, I continued. Now you get to live under it. That's when I decided to pull up the document archive system on my laptop. If they wanted to play games with hidden clauses, I was going to show them what real investigation looked like. Legal documents in our system were a disaster. Files buried in folders with names like Final Real Version and Do Not Delete Actual. But I knew how to dig. Searched for the clause reference number. SPK 44472. Stephen Parker's initials, clear as daylight. The file surfaced immediately. Time-stamped March 15th, 11:42 p.m. Uploaded from Stephen's office terminal the week before he cleaned out his desk and disappeared into Arizona retirement. The old devil had known exactly what was coming. I opened the document change history, and there it was. A surgical insertion between routine clause updates. Hidden between corporate housekeeping sat a nuclear option, written in perfect legal language and addressed specifically to me. Stephen Parker wrote this, I announced to the room. 8 months ago. Before Kevin was interim COO, before the CEO left for Singapore, before any of you knew this deal existed. Michelle looked stunned. Why didn't he tell anyone? Because he knew you wouldn't listen, I thought, but didn't say it out loud. Stephen had watched me work in silence for years, while everyone else played politics and collected titles. He'd seen me fix problems nobody else could solve, plug leaks nobody else noticed. When the time came to write an insurance policy, he wrote it for the one person who actually did the work. Here's what I found when I really started digging into Kevin's numbers. Slide 14 of the Singapore presentation showed a clean list of holdings, but the back-end data told a different story. Elexon AG, a Hong Kong subsidiary with active litigation in 2 jurisdictions, had been completely erased from the final version. Kevin had made a $50 million legal liability disappear with the delete key. Slide 19 was even better. Thailand risk exposure showed as 2.1% in Kevin's pretty presentation, but the raw data said 8.7%. He'd been cooking the books like a short-order chef, serving up fiction to Singapore's investment team. I printed out the evidence and walked back to the main conference room. By now, legal was scrambling. The board members were exchanging those looks that meant someone's career was about to end, and Kevin was sitting there like a man watching his lottery ticket blow away in the wind. Kevin, I said, laying the papers in front of him. You want to explain why Elexon AG doesn't exist in your presentation but shows up as a $50 million liability in our actual books? His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. That's when my phone rang. International number, Singapore prefix. I stepped into the hallway and answered. Jason Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell, this is David Tan from Singapore Legal. We understand there's been a change in oversight authority? That's correct. I'm handling all acquisition-related decisions until further notice. Excellent. We've been reviewing the discrepancies. If you're willing to work with us directly on corrections, we're prepared to proceed. But we won't move forward with Mr. Walsh in any capacity. I smiled for the first time all day. I think we can make that work. When I walked back into the boardroom, Kevin was already packing his things. Scott Davis had called for a formal vote. Kevin suspended. Pending investigation. Jason Mitchell granted interim authority. Unanimous. 22 years of quiet competence had finally paid off. Stephen Parker's parting gift had turned me from background player into the guy holding all the cards. I picked up my phone and dialed Aaron's emergency line. When he answered from 35,000 feet, sounding panicked about the messages from Singapore, I kept it simple. Your nephew tried to cook the books. Singapore caught him. The deal's still alive, but Kevin's done. I'm handling it now. Long pause. Then, can you save it? Already am. As I hung up, I realized Stephen Parker had taught me one last lesson. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's being the one person they can't afford to lose. Turns out 22 years of being underestimated wasn't a weakness. It was the longest job interview of my life, and I'd just gotten the promotion I never knew I wanted.